Welcome back. This is Brian Kidd with Unriddler, and today we are talking about SAP ALV Grid. We'll be discussing in this section how we work with totals. And in some cases, we may only need a simple total, and this would be a total for the entire data set that we're looking at in the ALV grid. But there will be times where we want to add subtotals based on other columns, and we'll see how to do that. And we'll also see another feature that I don't see used very often, but is quite handy, and that is the expanding and collapsing of subtotal fields. Back in SAP, as we look at our cost center data, we'll see that again we have these similar columns that we saw in previous videos on sorting, but we have the posting date, a cost element name, document type, and what we're going to focus on first is this value and reporting currency. That this would be a good candidate for a total because we may be looking at a specific cost element or a specific cost center that I'm responsible for. I may want to see totals for the value and reporting currency. So as we've done in previous videos, I'm going to start off with the change layout dialog screen, and we'll see how to add a total there, but then I'll also show you how easily you could add that same total from the ALV grid. Let's open the change dialog. And what's a bit different about totals is that the totaling functionality is integrated within other tabs. So we don't have a specific tab for totaling, but what we do have is on this displayed column screen, once I've chosen the column and I've got all my columns here on the left hand side, I do also have this aggregation column where we can see the sigma here, and you can see next to value and reporting currency I have the option to select that aggregation column here. Now you'll also notice that of course aggregation is only available on fields that would make sense to aggregate, so we would never add two posting dates together nor two cost elements together. We would only add a total to something like a currency amount or a quantity would be another example. So of course ALV grid is smart enough to know which columns are columns that are candidates for totaling, and in that particular column or set of columns we'll have this option to add a subtotal, and add a total. So let's go ahead and select this, and once we have it selected I can adopt those changes, and because our data set, we have multiple rows here, and you can notice by the scroll bar over here that there's a lot of data in here. In the initial screen we really don't see anything that much different other than in the column header SAP has again added us an indicator to let us know what's going on with that column, and in this case we have the sigma icon here that we can tell that we have in fact added a total to the value and reporting currency column. The reason we can't see that is, of course, we've got so much data here we would need to scroll down to the very bottom to actually see that total, but we have added a total here in the value and reporting currency. Adding the total from the change layout dialog was quite easy, but let's have a look at how we could do that directly on the report. Now what I'm going to do to start off is to go back and remove the total on the value reporting currency from the change dialog and apply those changes. So now we no longer have any totals, but it's quite easy to do it from the ALV grid simply by selecting the column, and then along our toolbar you can see that we have a total option on the toolbar, and simply clicking on that option will add the total for us. Now, what I like about doing it from the grid itself rather than open the change layout dialog is it's a couple of less clicks, but also you'll notice that the screen went ahead and scrolled to the bottom of the data set so that I could see that that total's been added. I do like that rather than having to scroll down myself. Not such an issue if you only have a relatively small data set like we do today, but many times you'll have many more line items than this. So I like the fact that from the ALV grid it immediately shows me that total, and I can be sure that it has been added. Okay, we've seen how simple it is to add a total to a column. We'll now move into subtotaling, which you'll find very helpful, and I really like the way that the ALV grid handles subtotaling and how it applies a sort, as of course you would have to have a sort on that column first before you could add a subtotal to it. But let's see how to do this again from the change dialog, and then I'll show you how to do it from the ALV grid. Let's open the change dialog. And as I mentioned earlier, the totaling is integrated within other columns here. It doesn't have its own separate column. It is integrated within the columns. And on the Display Columns tab, we can see that our value in reporting currency has been selected. So we know that we have a total on that column, but let's say that we want a subtotal based on the cost element. I'm going to now go to the Sort Order tab, and from here I'm going to add my cost element as I do anytime that I want to add a sort. But you probably noticed this column earlier in the discussion when we were talking about sorting, but I didn't speak to it at that time. But we have a sort in ascending or sorted in descending, but we also have this calculate subtotals column that I can choose to select. And now that I have that selected, I'm letting the system know that I want to see subtotals by cost element. So let's adopt those changes and we'll see what the data looks like. Now we have not only our total at the bottom of the screen, the grand total, we now also have subtotals by cost element. So this is a really nice display. It's very apparent where the this subtotal based on cost element 211-100 starts and when it ends, and you can see that the grid also includes the cost element value in the row that contains the subtotal. So now we can see based on cost element groups. So we've seen how easy it is to add a cost element. I want to now add a second subtotal based on not only the cost element but also on the offsetting account field. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I prefer to see the items that are being subtotaled or sorted together. I prefer seeing those next to each other. Okay, we've seen how easy it is to add a subtotal based on a single column. Let's add a second subtotal based on our offsetting account column. And I've moved the offsetting account over a little bit to the left so that we can see it in line with our cost element name, and our offsetting account. So let's apply a second subtotal based on the offsetting account, and we'll do it from the change dialog. Let's go to sort order, and then under offsetting account I'm going to move that over to our list, and I'm also going to select that I want subtotals on this column. Let's adopt those changes. And now we have a second subtotal, and we can see that we have a sort icon that we talked about earlier in the sorting section. I added to each of our columns, and in many cases the cost element and the offsetting account are kind of in sync here, where we don't see multiple offsetting accounts for this particular cost element. But as we scroll down, we do have a couple of options or situations where we do have that come into play. So down in our section that we looked at earlier, which was office and building, we see this cost element of 470000, but when these were posted, they were posted to different offsetting accounts. So these three rows were posted to offsetting account 1100, but these two rows were posted to 3511. So here we can see this play out, that we have two subtotals, one the primary by the cost element, and then a secondary sort and subtotal by offsetting account, and we can see how that's displayed. All of these fields, all of this column is merged, and then it's broken out by the different offsetting account values here on the offsetting account field. Now that we've seen how to add subtotals from the change layout dialog, let's go back to the change layout dialog and let's remove those subtotals, and I'll show you how to do that directly from the screen. So if I move these columns back over to the column set and apply that, we've retained our total on the value and reporting currency, but we no longer have any subtotals. Okay, now what I'd like to show is how to apply a subtotal directly on the ALV grid, and the easiest way to see that is I'm going to first open the change layout dialog, and I'm going to remove our current subtotals by just moving the fields over to the column set and removing them from the criteria list. Now that I've done that, I'm back to my data set, but of course I still have my subtotal based on the value and reporting currency field. So from here, if I wanted to add a subtotal, because I've already added this total to this value and reporting currency, I now have a different button on the toolbar for subtotaling. Now if you do not see the subtotal button on your toolbar, you may want to check to see if you've already have a field that you're totaling on, because if you do not have a field that you have a total on, you will not have this option. But because we do have a total, I'm going to now select my cost element column and now apply the subtotal to that column. And you'll notice directly here on the ALV grid, we've been able to add a subtotal based on the cost element simply by selecting a column and choosing the subtotal field. Now I also showed you earlier that in sorting, we have the option to sort on more than one column by the change layout dialog, which I showed earlier. But you can also do it from the screen, but you have to do it by using the control key or by dragging across and selecting multiple columns. Now I don't, in this case, want a subtotal on the cost element name, because again, it wouldn't be any different than a cost element, because the cost element name is of course dependent on the cost element. But I do want to have a subtotal on the offsetting account column. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to first check cost element again, because although I have a subtotal in it, the system's expecting me to select all columns that I want to apply the subtotal to. And then I'm going to hold the control key down and at the same time choose offsetting account. And now that I have both of these selected, I can now choose my subtotal, and you can see that I've again applied the subtotal on both the cost element and now the offsetting account column. And if we return to what we discussed earlier, we can see our office building and our subtotal within the office building cost element for the offsetting account and 1100 and 3511. The last thing that I want to show you is that uh, certainly the subtotaling of values is very helpful, but you may want to get this down to a single screen and you may want to only focus on the subtotals. And if you find that something in the subtotal looks a little uh, like something you would want to do some more analysis on and you want to see the line item data, there's a way to collapse the records to only see subtotals. And let me show you how to do that. Uh, you can scroll to the bottom of the data set and we can see our grand total here. But we also have this collapse selection icon. And let me show you what happens when you do that. Because we already have cost element, subtotal, and offsetting account, let's have a look at what happens when we collapse the selection. So this is quite interesting. Now I can practically within a single screen without scrolling, I can see my subtotals for my cost elements quite easily here. Now this is because I collapsed it and did it at the grand total level. What it does is show me the subtotals for the very first column in the subtotaling. So because the offsetting account was a secondary column in subtotaling, I do not at this level see the total or the subtotal by the offsetting account. But let me show you how we would do that. If, for example, we know that we have two offsetting accounts that we would like to see the subtotals for those, next to my column here for the cost element, I have this option of expand the selection. So let's expand that, and by clicking one time, we can now see the subtotals on the next level of detail, which is the offsetting account. So I'm still seeing cost element 470000, but I'm also seeing the subtotal for offsetting account 1100 and 3511 within this cost element. So that's just a tip if you ever need to see and you rather just focus on the subtotals, you can do that by collapsing the data set and then expand it as you see necessary. So if I see a number that seems quite high, let's say that what was this legal social expense and why is that so high, I can expand that down. And now I'm seeing my subtotal by offsetting account. In this case, I only had one offsetting account for legal social expense. So I would then expand that down, and now I can see the actual line item detail that makes up that subtotal on the offsetting account as well as the cost element.